would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. So I'm teaching here in Berlin, but it's my first appearance here. What I will offer you today is a potpourri of an interpretation of different intellectual approaches in trying to interpret the Cold War and the period since end of the Cold War. So what I try to offer you is a structural interpretation of world order in the long 20th or in the American century. And the three stages, first I will briefly deal with some terms of the three stages of a continuum from war to peace. On the one, tensions and detente in a bipolar world. On crisis, conflicts and wars. And on armistice and peace agreements. So with regard to the historical, what I call historical macrostructures and turning points, as a young German a student of history, I've been very much influenced, so I don't speak French, but the major influence comes from Fernand Braudels, from the French school of the Annales of Social History, with his three historical times, and I will play with this a little bit. I will also deal with the phases of Earth history, with the phases of political and Earth history and the turning points. And the new turning points we are just entering now to give you a much longer perspective, and this carries over then to my speech on Monday. Now, with regard to tensions, to the concepts, I looked up various dictionaries, and what I found, obviously, tensions is out of mode. In many dictionaries, Wikipedia, Wikidictionary, and the more serious ones like Shorter Oxford Dictionary, if you look at the term, you don't find a reference, connotation to politics. You find it to physiology, physics, and psychology. And Encyclopedia Britannica and other major dictionaries have no entry on tensions. So I looked then on the German word tension and on various similar dictionaries like the Encyclopedia Britannica. And of course, the Brockhaus in 1957 had no reference to the term. But it had a reference in the last two editions of the 1990s and of 2006. And there it defined tensions as relationship for a longer enduring situation of a more or less latent social conflict between individuals and social groups. Not even, didn't even refer to international relations. And a lot of others, I don't want to bother you in detail, they had no entrance on it. So I looked on the opposite term. If there's tension, there's détente. And again, if I looked at Wikipedia, the first entry was really funny. It was a reference to an American thrash metal band, the Deterrent band. Had nothing to do with the topic, but the next what follows was more or less correct. The Short Oxford Dictionary said détente, it's a French word, is an easing of strained relations, especially between states. And that comes very close. And the Oxford Companion of 1993, one article by Robert Litwak, an American social scientist, he more or less defined détente with the period of Nixon and the Nixon Doctrine as the phase of American-Soviet relations from 1969 to 1974 or 76. Now, if I look at the same in the German dictionaries, interestingly, there's much more reference to Entspannung, the German word of détente, and there the focus is also different. It's not only the American-Soviet relation of the late 60s and 70s, especially on Ostpolitik, on the multilateralization of détente in Europe with regard to Germany and Poland, Soviet Union at that time, but also then the pan-European process of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, with regard to conflicts, again, I try to use the same tool to look what do students who use dictionaries find about these terms. And the Oxford Shorter Dictionary, certainly, here you can see fight, battle, prolonged struggle between opposing forces, and so on. But there are a lot of other references to physiology and physics. And what I think is important, there is no general agreement on conflict. So there is a research program in international relations on conflict and peace research, very much from the liberal context. If I look now on war, and to give you an overview, And this was a slide done by the Uppsala conflict department and the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And this gives you an overview of 60 years. And what you see really the biggest conflicts, you see the black line, an increase of the number of conflicts between 45 to about 1990, and then it is declining. If you look at the second of the battle deaths, you see certainly two extremes. One is the Korean War, which then had a very important impact on changing. It was also a turning point of East-West relations, and then certainly the Vietnam War, which was also a turning point in East-West relations. And then you see, but also after 1990, we see a couple of increases, certainly the wars in the Balkan, in Yugoslavia, and then in Iraq. And there you don't have Iraq and Afghanistan, but you also don't have the drug war in Mexico, where about 30,000 people died in the last 30 years. So with regard to peace agreements, the topic you gave me, I looked. And the classical reference in international law, you had a declaration of war, you had an armistice and peace agreement. But if you look in the post-World War II period, there were very few formal peace agreements. Germany never had signed a peace treaty. So we had the surrender on the 8th of May, unconditional surrender. We had a kind of replacement, of the peace agreement with a 2+4 treaty of September 1990, where the parties were the two Germanys before the reunification on the one side, and then the four Allied powers. But it was no traditional peace agreement. But it has their components of constraint of the use of force, which then caused some problems during the war in the Balkans, and especially then in Iraq, because Germany officially, according to this 2+4 treaty, is only to involve its forces under a mandate of the UN Security Council. And the second, that in the former GDR, no nuclear weapons are to be installed. So indirectly, this agreement is a nuclear weapon-free treaty for Berlin and the 5 states that were before the GDR. Now, let me look on peace agreements if you're interested. I think one of the best sources is INCOR, the University of Ulster, and there you can look on the peace agreements they list, on the text they list for different regions of the world. Now, on the basic terms, what I can say, tension and détente seem to be out of mode. They're not defined anymore. In dictionaries, you don't find them anymore. There are other terms that obviously producers of those encyclopedia think very important for the readers to consult. So conflict remains a very important concept. Peace agreement, yes, but peace treaty has become very peripheral. So most wars after World War II, again, were neither declared nor terminated by a peace agreement. Now I want to switch and play a little bit with the British school and the French structural history for the American century. So my goal is to contextualize international relations since 1945 by focusing on phases of the Cold War. And the English school, which was more or less traditional, focusing on 3 traditions of politics and security, is not very sexy text. It's an article, a book by Martin White and Hadley Bull, who made it, I think, introduced it really in the international relations thinking. It's a categorization of the thought on international relations linked with 3 philosophers. On the one hand, Hobbes for the realist thinking, on the other hand, Kant for the idealist or universalist thinking, and the third, Grotius, the founder of modern international law from the Netherlands, a contemporary of Hobbes, of the rationalist, or I call it pragmatic thinking in international relations. The second prism I would like to play with is with the French School of Social History, and especially with the work of Fernand Braudel and his different times, the history of long durations, the history of medium duration, and the history of short duration. And if I try to apply the different times, I look especially at the history of the medium duration, of the cycles on the conjunctures with regard to the phases of the Cold War, and with regard to order and the changes in order during the last 60 years or so. If we look at the turning points since the French Revolution, we can detect at least 4 major turning points of European order, which at that time also was at least the first 2, was international order. And the first 3 were all the outgrowths of major wars or revolutions. But the 4th was different, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was the only peaceful transition in European and world history we have seen, but the aftermath was not peaceful. So I think this is, we have a new international disorder since 1990, and we have to look what were the reasons, what was the lack of vision, what were the lack of plans for initiating a new international order. So if I look at the 3, let's say, the conceptual leadership of the United States in the long American century, certainly at the end of World War I, the American military and economic power was crucial. And Wilson wanted to break with a diplomacy of secret diplomacy of balance of power in Europe. And he tried to introduce in international relations the vision of Kant in his Eternal Peace of 1795, and his 3 definite articles. That there should be a League of Nations, that there should be the system of rule of states should be, Kant said, republican. Today we would say democratic. So to make the world safe for democracy. And the third was, Kant referred to cosmopolitan law. Today we probably would say legal governments or rule of law, human rights. So Wilson was the big innovator. He was a Kantian. The others, and I come back to it, had different perspective. And the tragedy of the next 20 years and the beginning of World War II was, let's say, a failure of partly of Versailles and also of domestic politics of implementing it. Now, from 1940 to 50, we had a fundamental change in the United States, from isolation to internationalism. To prevent a setback, to prevent a repetition of that, the Congress stopped isolationism. It was not as clear after 1945, but Roosevelt had a vision, and he was very skilled in preparing the audience to an internationalist role. So from 1950 then to 1989, it was a Cold War where the US played a leading conception and political dominance. But I would say in 1989 and 1990, so there were a lot of achievements of US diplomacy, especially with regard to German unification, but there was also lack of vision, both by the United States and the European Union, to prepare a new international order. So there was a vision thing, or the lack of visions. Now, with regard to the English school, the 3 traditions Martin White and Hadley Bull referred to is, on the one hand, the realist or the Hobbesians, the rationalists or the universalists, the Gramscians, and the revolutionists, the Kantians, or the revolutionists and universalists, the Kantians, and the rationalists and pragmatists, the Gramscians. And these 3 you find in the American categorization, you find them also. But we had 4 or 5 different debates. But if you look back to the deep structures of the arguments, you can see that these 3 ideal type visions, and you can also try to map them in other international tradition in other countries. Now, the English school was somewhat in between. It was a Gramscian perspective. It was between power politics and utopianism, a very pragmatic British perspective. And I myself, so I'm German, I consider myself as a Grotian. These are the three guys whose ideas I play with. So both Hobbes and Grotius were political refugees in Paris from the domestic wars in England and the religious confrontation in the Netherlands. They both wrote their major books, Leviathan, Hobbes, and War and Peace, Grotius, in Paris when they were political refugees. Kant never left Königsberg, but he is probably one of the German philosophers who had a tremendous influence on the thinking, and also who encapsulated in his treatise on internal peace, on the thinking on international relations. I've not seen any other source where you have it as dense. So the terms certainly have changed during the last 200 years. Now, with regard to Braudel, the three terms he introduced, and I just give you one quote on the Histoire des Structures, or the Histoire de longue durée, on the history of long duration. He said, this is the man, the human being, in its relation to the environment. All the changes are slow, constant, there are constant repetitions, timeless history, the man's contact with the inanimate. And my interpretation, the way I use it now, is to look at the interaction between the Earth and the human system. And I refer to a transition which is much longer term, from the Holocene, the end, let's say the beginning or the end of the glacial period 12,000 years ago, up to the Industrial Revolution. And with the Industrial Revolution, a new period of Earth history, not human history, but also human history, started. And for this, the Nobel laureate in chemistry, Crutzen, coined the term Anthropocene. I will go back to this at the end of these lectures and more on Monday. Now, what I be talking now is more on the Histoire de Conjoncture, or on the, in my interpretation, on the phases of international order and security systems. If I look at the history of events, these are the conflicts and the peace settlements, but I have not the time to look into it. Now, if we look at the international transformation of international order, so Vienna as an outgrowth of the Napoleonic War, you had the concept of Vienna. So there were wars in Europe, certainly, between 1815 and 1940. In many, Prussia and Germany was involved, but there was no major war. So to some extent, this system functions to prevent an escalation of these wars that were going on to escalate to an all-over European or world war. This system collapsed in 1914. Those who had the different visions were Tsar Alexander, Prince Metternich, Viscount Castlereagh, and Prince Talleyrand. And I played once, I have not the time here, with the English school, try to apply this with this period of transition. Now, at Versailles, you have the similar. You have with Woodrow Wilson, you had a Kantian universalist to make the world safe for democracy, get rid of secret diplomacy, and install a League of Nations, a collective security system. Lloyd George, he was a pragmatist. He wanted to save certainly the British Empire and the balance of power politics. Clemenceau was a Hobbesian pessimist. Clemenceau, in his lifetime, he had seen twice 1870-71 German troops walking, and then in the World War I, German troops walking down the Champs-Élysées. So this was a nightmare. He had the historical experience, we have to stop it. So his interest, and it's very understandable with his personal experience, was to contain Germany, to punish Germany, to prevent that this history repeats itself. And so this was part then introduced in the Versailles Treaty, peace treaty, the last big peace treaty, with the demilitarization, with the reparations and so on, and the limitation of the German forces. And he also wanted security guarantees from the Americans. Wilson promised them, but due to the role of Congress and the non-signing of the Versailles Peace Treaty, they were never implemented. So this was, let's say, the tragedy of a debate between the Kantian and the Hobbesian perspective. So the Kantian made compromises to the Hobbesian perspective, but then domestic politics totally overruled. Now, in World War II, the perspective had changed. Roosevelt was already Secretary of Navy during World War I. Yeah, so he was to some extent still Wilsonian, but he was also much more realist. He wanted to install a system, what he called the four world policemen. And the four world policemen became then the permanent powers of the Security Council. They have a collective security system with teeth, with military teeth. And he said, now if the Germans or any others should enter into aggression again, we'll send our airplanes and stop them. Yeah, so it was a very clear vision to use force against the aggressor. But then the third, well, this was Roosevelt's idea. Churchill, he was a mixture of a Gramscian and a Hobbesian. He wanted first save the British Empire. Yeah, and he was thinking in realist terms, in regional terms, where Britain could have more a fundamental role in Africa, in parts of Asia, and so on. But Roosevelt overruled him. Roosevelt, given the American political, economic power, was instrumental. Stalin, on the other hand, he was the Machiavellian realist. He wanted to maintain the power and to stabilize it. And then there was various compromises made at Yalta. For example, the veto right. And this compromise Roosevelt made to Stalin, this paralyzed the whole system of the poor policemen for World War II, for the post-World War period. Now, I can skip a lot of this. I've already mentioned this, and for time reason. Now, the three security systems in the UN Charter are, on the one hand, the universal system of collective security, the system of Roosevelt's four policemen, that were at that time the United States, UK, China, and Russia, not yet France. France then came later as the fifth policeman. And this is enshrined in chapters 6 on the Pacific settlement of dispute, relevant for our conference, and chapter 7 on the action with regard to threats to the peace and breaching of the peace and acts of aggression. The second system enshrined in the UN Charter is the regional arrangement and agency. That was the impact of the Latin American countries at the Chapultepec Conference in February 1945. And so that if there's a conflict, it should first be settled regionally, and then, if not, then globally. But then there was a third system, which was part of the compromise, of the domestic compromise in the US, and part of Roosevelt's bipartisan and Truman's bipartisan policy. It was the Vandenberg Resolution. Vandenberg was a leading Republican internationalist, counter to Taft, who was representing the isolationist tradition within the Republican Party. And Vandenberg said we have to add the right of individual and collective self-defense. This was the basis, Article 51 of military alliances. And that then became the basis of the Cold War security system, two military alliances standing against each other. The other two were paralyzed, especially due to the price Roosevelt paid at Yalta to Stalin, the veto. Now, the American role in the transformations, very briefly, in Vienna, in 1815, the US was a small outsider. In 1823, there was Washington was even ransacked by the British, falling in from Canada. It was the first of the three foreign interventions. The second was Pearl Harbor, and the third Al-Qaeda on the 9/11. But in World War I, as I've said, in Versailles, this had changed. But we also see the tensions between the international role and domestic politics. And in the aftermath, I think of the Versailles Treaty and establishing the League of Nations, Wilson failed to get congressional support. And so the major power that had engineered the innovation was no party. So I think that was the beginning of the end of the League of Nations. And also the domestic politics, you had a backlash of the isolationists that lasted up to World War II, and then Roosevelt was very careful in changing public opinion. He played with the idea, but he asked of the four policemen, but he asked a journalist, and I've seen the transcript in Hyde Park, and he said to him, now go out and put pressure on me. Yeah? And he looked very carefully at the public opinion polls. And when he saw, and then once he saw public opinion was changing, he went a little bit further. But he wanted to avoid the same backlash as Wilson had experienced, as he had experienced as a Secretary of the Navy in Wilson's administration. So after World War II, certainly the United States was the strongest military, economic, and cultural ideological superpower, and it had the willingness to lead. And this required a domestic consensus. And again, Roosevelt was very keen and very skillful trying to bring the Republicans in a bipartisan policy which permitted a leadership role of the United States. U.S. had also a very clear vision of the world order, and this planning started, and I've seen this in the National Archives. In 1939, the State Department and their War Department started to plan the post-war order. And I remember 123 boxes of post-war planning within the government, but also in New York, the Council of Foreign Relations and the Committee of Economic Development and many others. So security design from the League of Nations, the first system collapsed. In 1945, Roosevelt was very keen to avoid the failures of Versailles. Now, what was the Cold War? This is, you have at least two different perspectives. The one people, and this has something to do with the worldviews of scientists. Some say it started, it was a systemic competition of two military, political, economic, social, and cultural ideological systems. And if you interpret it that way, the start has been in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. If you see it as a power struggle between two alliances, then it started after World War II, between 1945 and 1950. When did it end? Again, it's not too easy. Certainly the year of the turn was 1989. But there were various events earlier, since 1980 with Solidarność, or let's say the movement for the campaign for European disarmament, an equivalent to the campaign for nuclear disarmament in the UK. And I was involved a little bit with Mary Calder in 1980, and my condition was neither Pershing nor SS-20. So that made it impossible to instrumentalize the peace issue for one side only. And Mary Calder was then very keen to link disarmament with human rights. So she became persona non grata. She could not travel to the East anymore because she had very close contacts to the many groups of opposition. So it was an intellectual for 10 years, from 1980 to 85, 86, we had a discussion on the transformation of Europe. It was an intellectual debate. And very often, the dissidents from the East, the first two rows I remember in Perugia were empty because none of them was permitted to come. But this was, for me as a scientist, it probably was the most creative period of free thinking on the change. And many of our ideas we then mentioned later on at ISA conferences in the US, the young people working for Gorbachev, Abatov Jr. and others, we had a lot of intensive discussions on confidence-building measures, on non-offensive defense, and a lot of these were transported by the young people to Gorbachev as part of his perestroika politics, which the goal was to maintain, to save the Soviet system, but at the same time, it changed the East-West conflict totally. Now, which are the phases of the Cold War? I can run through this fast. I distinguish about 7 phases of the Cold War and 4 phases of the post-Cold War era. With regard to the first phase, that was really the phase of the transition, and where you had, on the one hand, in the US, the institutionalization of the national security state, with the National Security Act of 1947 that created for the first time the Pentagon, the Department of Defense. Before you had a War and a Navy Department, a joint vision of the military, and the other was the CIA was also created as part and outgrowth. Then you had a debate on the US role within the State Department. On the one hand, there was George Kennan, critic of the Soviet Union all through his life. He wanted an ideological, economic, and political containment of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, his opponent in the internal battle in the State Department was Paul Nitze. And Paul Nitze, in January 1950, he drafted NSC 68, which he called for a quadrupling of the military expenditure. Nitze called for a global military strategy. And this NSC 68 was implemented after the Korean War. So the Korean War was a trigger, let's say, then Nitze could use for the implementation of his vision. And this, for the first time, then, you had, let's say, the resources allocated to the global military role of the United States after NSC 68. You had a lot of variation afterwards. I don't have the time to go into. Certainly, the major other change was the conflict in Greece and Turkey, which was a trigger then for the implementation of the Marshall Plan. I come back to that a couple of minutes later. And certainly the Berlin crisis, where the United States, Britain, and France saved this city and prevented the takeover by the Soviet Union. So then we had also in the late 40s the creation of the first military alliances. There the perspective was very much, the first fear was Germany. The second was the Soviet Union. And the fear, understandable, was we have to be careful that Germany, the history doesn't repeat itself. And there's one quote assigned to Lord Ismay, who was a leading figure in NATO. I'm not so sure whether it's true, but it has been quoted quite often, that the task of NATO should be to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. So it was in a nutshell, let's say the feeling of 47, 48, and 49. To try to solve the German issue. But let's say the other debate on dealing with Germany in the United States that was going on between, I would say, 1944 and 47, 48 was on the one hand Morgenthau, on the other Marshall. Punishment or integration. And fortunately, Marshall succeeded on the background of the conflict between in the internal conflict in Greece. So that was a trigger that permitted ideas that were developed since 1943-44 by the business community in New York, that these could be implemented then under the name of the Marshall Plan. With regard to the Cold War, we had the first 2 triggers of the turning points were the Korean War, the militarization of East-West relations, and the second, let's say, the turn to a limited détente was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when both were at the brink of war and recognized we have no communication system to avoid that there is an unintended escalation into a third world war. There were various, let's say, opportunities and missed opportunities, 53, 52, 53. They are still disputed among historians. Certainly in 1955 there was a brief hope, And this resulted in the unification of Austria and the peace treaty with Austria and the neutral status of Austria. And then with a turn, the first agreement, arms control agreement, was a limited test ban treaty in 1963. Now, the limited détente, you had the reduction of the probability of an unintended nuclear war and functional economic cooperation, but at the same time, conflicts went on. The US intervention in the Dominican Republic, the US war in Vietnam, the USSR intervention in the Czech Republic. But independent of these conflicts, there were areas, three issue areas of cooperation. First, arms control, limited test ban treaty, Tlatelolco treaty, outer space treaty, non-proliferation treaty, I think an issue we will discuss on Monday. They were all possible on the background, on the joint interest of both the United States and the Soviet Union to get some rules into the nuclear competition, to prevent an unintended escalation into war. And one element was the establishment of a so-called, in German, heißer Draht, hot wire, direct communication between the White House and the Kremlin that did not exist before. Now, the high time of détente was the Nixon period. What was the reason of learning? It was the Vietnam War. You cannot fight a war and at the same time go full speed into the nuclear competition. So this crisis of the Vietnam War was also stimulated efforts to look for solutions. So you had the ongoing conflicts in Vietnam, in Angola, you had other, but you had then major agreements, the first disarmament agreement, the Biological Weapons Convention, and I'm very happy that Arthur Westing is here, who has written on this at length, and I'm a student of yours on these issues, as in many others. And then the SALT I Treaty, the ABM Treaty, and the crisis management agreements, improved communication links, agreement on nuclear accidents, and nuclear war of 1972. So the turning point was more or less when Nixon was kicked out of office in 1974. This, as far as the US is concerned, this limited détente gradually came to an end. But in this third phase, from 75 to 79, in the other phase before, certainly Ostpolitik started. Yeah, and very much supported. So first there were some doubts about Egon Bahr by Kissinger, but then I think the US fully supported after the Moscow and the Warsaw Treaty of 1970. The US was instrumental in the Berlin Agreement of 1972. And my friend Jonathan Dean, at that time the deputy to Ambassador Rush, he was instrumental for negotiating the Berlin Agreement. This was the first step towards the multilateralization of détente in Europe. And all of these efforts then resulted in Helsinki in 1975 in the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, with the three pillars of arms control and disarmament on the one hand, economic environmental issues in the second bastard, and the third also on human rights issues. Now this was a sign of hope for the dissidents in the East, because these documents were also published in the East. So they relied, they used these and called, now we want the implementation of the human rights laws in the Soviet Union, in the in Czechoslovakia and many other countries. So this was a high time of détente in Europe, at a time when it was already on the downturn in the US, when the Committee of the Danger, Snitze and others played a major role and called for a major increase of US military expenditure during the Carter period. Also what we have seen then is a confidence building regime and human rights law agreements we have seen after the follow-up of Helsinki in Belgrade 78. But then the turning points, I think there were two. One was the INF treaty, INF agreement, INF decision of NATO, to use a double strategy to negotiate, but at the same time to plan the deployment of intermediate nuclear forces. And this was a trigger of the European disarmament campaign of 1980. But the second trigger, the major trigger that ended the limited détente, was the Soviet intervention into Afghanistan 2 weeks later. I'm not sure whether they are interrelated. This is not my argument. I just point to these turning points. Now, the Second Cold War, interestingly enough, you had only minor US military involvements in Lebanon, in Grenada, but you had a major involvement of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan that lasted from 79 to 89. You had three issue areas of cooperation, but primarily outside of the East-West context. You had the Rarotonga nuclear weapon zone in the Asian Pacific, or in the Pacific. Yeah? You had some functional agreement, convention on certain conventional weapons, and the Madrid follow-up. But all of this was then blocked by the new tensions. So the turning point was Afghanistan, and the second turning point to the next phase was Gorbachev becoming the Soviet president in 1985. Now, the conflicts in Afghanistan was continuing, the disarmament talks were continuing, and now we had, after the change in the Soviet Union, but also the change in the US. And interestingly enough, the key person who was instrumental in changing the policy of the State Department was Paul Nitze. Paul Nitze, the person, and I had many talks with him when he was in his early 90s on this time. So he was instrumental, let's say, for the militarization of US foreign policy, but he saw the unique opportunity. Clearer, Genscher and a couple of others saw it too. Many others were very critical, and there was a battle on Nitze on one hand and the others. And Nitze argued, and Reagan followed him, and the Secretary of the State Department followed him to use the opportunity to enter into agreement. INF Treaty was the first, the Stockholm Agreement on Confidence Security Building Measures in '86 was the first, then came ANF, and then the Vienna follow-up. So the turning point that at the end of the Cold War, the symbolic one, was certainly 21 years ago, next Tuesday, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, 1990 was then the year of transition, of and evolving conflicts, and also, I think, missed wrong signals and missed opportunities, both on the crisis of Yugoslavia and Iraq. There were three issues of cooperation: the Treaty on Limitation and Reduction of Armed Forces in Europe, and the Vienna document on confidence-building measures. So the turning point we have seen after the Berlin Wall, within 6-7 weeks, all the governments in the East peacefully were transformed, with the exception of Romania, where the president of the party was killed. So it was a peaceful, the only peaceful change in modern history on a global level we have seen. Now, the next 10 years, there was not a new order. We had a lot of disorder. And many questions we still have to raise, and if we have a little bit of time for the discussion, what were these missed opportunities? If we look at the military expenditure, here we see very clearly, and this is based on CIPRI's data, we see some decline between 1988 and 1996. But since 1996, we see on a global level an increase, and especially since 2001, we see a dramatic increase. So this is a reflection of the many new conflicts, the different interpretation, or the continuous interpretation of world politics from the mindset of the Cold War. This, I think, you are all familiar with, more or less. With the military expenditure, these are the increases by country between 2000 and 2009. you see in the United States $335 billion increase, but in China the percentage increase is much higher, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So in 2009, these are the data for the first year of the Obama administration, the US still has about 43% of the world military expenditure. And so we had no peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. We had a new military confrontation and a new international disorder where we had no more a major state competition, at least, between two superpowers. Now, this is with regard to the military expenditure in terms of the amount and in terms of the percentage of GDP. And since 2008, we have a new global financial crisis. Now, what were the reasons for the end of the Cold War? It depends on the mindset you have. If you're a Hobbesian pessimist, you say, power mattered. It was our military superiority that brought the Russians down. They could not compete anymore. Well, Scholz said it was the US technological superiority. It was the IT revolution. In that regard, he probably was not wrong. Many others, I call them Gramscian pragmatists, have said there was a Soviet learning. It was perestroika. In 1989, when the confrontation was in Leipzig, in the 7th or 9th of October, 1989. The Soviet Union could have repeated 1953, and the West would not have intervened militarily in the GDR. But Gorbachev gave the instructions. The Russian troops have to stay in the barracks. Leipzig was encircled. But at that time, Masur and others, when the people came out from the peace prayers, were given candles, not to be able to use rocks. And the police was all around them, but there was no confrontation. And that was the beginning of the change, the deliberate decision by Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership not to use force. And then you see a unique combination we hardly have seen in history of those who had wanted reforms in the opposition, human rights, Václav Havel and many others in the East, and a leader who wanted to modernize the system. And there were many debates, and from some of my students here in Berlin who were with the East German armed forces, who have told me about the internal debates they had between their superior who wanted to use force against the population and those who were trained in Moscow and came back and were a source of moderation. So I think this unique opportunity, reform effort from the top, to save the system, to reduce the cost of the military, and the other side, the expectation from the bottom to change was crucial. Now, which were the four conceptual pillars of 60 years of peace in Europe? My argument is that ideas matter. And that there were four ideas of four people who may have made a difference. And I played with this at a conference, Israeli-Palestinian Water Conference, 6 years ago. I developed this for the first time in Antalya. And so my argument is those four, and I looked not for a German, I looked for intellectual representative of the four Allied powers. So I looked first for Britain and David Mitrani in his pamphlet, Fabian pamphlet on the working peace system, where he had developed a functionalist vision, that form follows function. And his hope was that there would be a spillover, that trust would be built through functional operation, the cooperation. And then you had George Marshall. And I go into the background a little bit more, how this idea, it was Biddle's idea, who developed it for Committee Economic Development in New York, chaired by Paul Hoffman, a businessman. And then when the Greek crisis evolved, the State Department took up that idea, and it was labeled the Marshall Plan. And Paul Hoffman was called in to manage it, and Biddle became his key conceptual person. So the idea was to integrate Germany, and also it was not all applauded. There was a lot of opposition in the House of Commons. To give Germany kind of, at that time, Germany had not its sovereignty back. It was still under the Federal Republic was not yet established. But the goal was to have an organization where Germany was a member, the OEEC, which later became the OECD. And I think this made the basic difference in Europe. Then, with the experience of the war, the readiness of the people who fought each other, especially on the French and German side, where each family had lost members in the many wars of the past, to work together. But the real key person whose vision was Monnet. And I come back to this, and the force, certainly, with regard to the end of the Cold War, was Gorbachev. Let's look first to David Mitrani, the functionalist concept of the working peace system. So this, to some extent, his ideas were instrumental for the functional cooperation, like ILO, the many of the functional cooperation, international organizations that were founded or existed, continue to exist in the context of the United Nations. The second, George Marshall's concept of conditionalized aid. And the third was Jean Monnet's concept of functional institution building. Now, Jean Monnet had a long career. He was a deputy Secretary General of the League of Nations. In 1940, when most of France was occupied by Germany, he headed the French-British Coordination Committee in Washington. And I have seen some of his ideas he submitted to the post-war planning in the State Department. So he had already many conceptual ideas, so he was part of the debate. And then in 1950, with the war in Korea, there was a lot of fear in France when the Americans insisted on the rearmament of Germany. This was a nightmare. Will history repeat itself? How will the Germans behave if they have troops again? Will they repeat their character? Will they at some stage become independent and move back, repeat acts of aggression? Then Monnet came with the idea of the functional cooperation of the industries that are instrumental for war making, coal and steel, creating a supranational institution, which became the first institution that later resulted in the European Union. And the second he proposed is a European cooperation defense issues, even possibly with joint forces. This was later killed in the National Parliament of France in 1954. It was defeated. But the first, and I think he had a clear vision of change in multilateral, in creating a supranational system for the industry that are instrumental for war making. So the Organization on Coal and Steel, 51, and then 57 on nuclear issues, and then the European Economic Cooperation. Out of all of this came later the European Union. That institution, I think that has helped Europe to guarantee the longest peace period of history we ever had. None of our fathers, grandfathers' generations had that experience of 65 years of non-fighting between the UK, Germany and the UK, Germany and France, and so on. So I think this is really, Jean Monnet was at the beginning of a change, and ideas matter. And I think the fourth is Mikhail Gorbachev, New Thinking, and this is from Gartov, Raymond Gartov, a former ambassador of the United States in Bulgaria, and his analysis that the decisive factor at the end of the Cold War was a change in beliefs, where Soviet leaders could discard a long encrusted and familiar ideology, and because of a powerful transformation in the way Gorbachev and some colleagues perceived reality, and because they were ready to adapt domestic and foreign policies to the new perception. So it was the new thinking, the new ideas that made the difference. The new thinking was not successful in saving the Soviet Union, but it was successful, very successful, for making this cooperation between reform efforts from the top and hope for reform from the bottom possible. Now in 1990 we had a lack of vision, we had a lack of plans, we had a lack of will. Certainly the achievements were the reunification of Germany and then of Europe. If we go back 20 years, there was a lot of fear again about Germany, by Mrs. Thatcher, but also by President Mitterrand. The fear was, how would Germany use its economic power, as the strongest economic power in Europe? And so there was a deal struck then between our Chancellor Kohl and Mitterrand, which called for a deepening and a widening of the European Union. The deepening was the common currency policy. This to overcome the French nightmare that the Bundesbank would dictate the terms of currency policy in Europe. And the widening, that opened then the possibility for enlargement. That was first in 2004 with the 10 new countries joining, and then 2 or 3 years later with Romania and Bulgaria joining, increasing the number of nations in the European Union from 15 to 27, which were the missed opportunities. I think there were many missed opportunities, both in Europe, in Germany, and also in the US. I've not followed up, probably the records are not yet available, which role a signal by the US ambassador to Iraq in summer prior to the invasion played. Whether this was instrumental or not, American troops were already in Saudi Arabia in much bigger number than was publicly acknowledged. But this is the area of speculation. I cannot answer this. But the second is, I think, the European Union. Let's first start with Germany. Germany sent wrong signals on Yugoslavia. And I think Genscher's push for an early recognition of Croatia and Slovenia created a lot of fears in France and in the UK and other countries because of history, because of the role of Germany in that region during World War II. What was missing is a clear signal of the European Union, a willingness. We are willing to enlarge the European Union, but only for a united Yugoslavia. So the summit, there was a summit in November 1990, just about 10 years ago in Paris. This could have become, let's say, a second Versailles, not with a peace treaty, but creating a new international order. But the main focus was not on the new international order, but was on preparing for the liberation of Kuwait, and which later was led to the ultimatum of the UN. And the second, I think, missed opportunity is solving the Middle East conflict. Now, we will all have, depending on which side we are close, have different opinions. Certainly, there may have been faults on many sides, but many of the things that evolved later may be related to the failure of solving that conflict. That is the longest conflict on the agenda, and it's the most difficult conflict to resolve. But other failures then, and they deal again with the relationship between international relations and US domestic politics, was climate policy, and we will see it again now when the new Congress is in, that international politics is to some extent taken hostage of different ideologies of the common people who may not know all the details of the change and the impact their vision may have on global developments. Have we a world without walls in 2010? We have different signals. We have the deborderization 20 years ago, but we have new walls coming up. The US-Mexican fence or wall. There's also a fence between India and Bangladesh to contain the migration from Bangladesh to India. And this is from an article we published in one of our books from a colleague from Bangladesh. Now, which is a new turning point? And I have already 60 minutes, I should really stop. The new turning point from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, I come back to Bourdelle. And to the vision of this person, a Nobel laureate in chemistry, who was one of the three who detected the ozone depletion, and he coined a new term of the Anthropocene as a period that started with James Watt's invention of the steam engine and with a massive use of hydrocarbons with the Industrial Revolution, coal, oil, and steel. And this resulted in changes between the Earth and human system. And this, if we now look back to the changes of Earth history, we have the 12,000 years since the end of the glacial period. We have a climate variability. And we have higher points and lower points. One of the high points of the climate optimum was the Roman Empire. And the medieval optimum was when there were a lot of cities and villages founded. The climate pessimum at the end of the Roman Empire was also the period when the massive migration in Europe and also in Asia occurred. So this was all climate variability. It was not yet anthropogenic climate change, but this starts on the right side with this sign going up. And this is the Holocene, and on this I will talk on Monday. Thank you so much for your attention, and apologies that I spoke 2 minutes longer than I promised.